Well, hello and welcome to the Movie Paradise. I'm your host, Nathanael Molnár, and this is Movie Night Tonight. Every single week here, we watch a new film and we discuss it in depth, with each month having a new theme. We are kicking off our month of February, which is our month of detective movies. And the film we are discussing tonight is 1958's Vertigo. Once again, I'm your host, Nathanael Molnár. I'm joined by Robert Giachinta. Rob, thanks for being here.
No problem.
Here all the time. Good to have you.
Yeah.
So before we get into our spoiler discussion, and this is a spoiler discussion, we are talking about Vertigo as if you watched it with us. I want to start this off by going around and saying what our first impressions of the movie are and roughly how many times we've seen it, starting with Rob.
I've never seen this movie. In fact, this is probably the second oldest movie I've ever seen in my life.
Really?
Because I looked at 12 Angry Men, that was 57. And
you've never seen anything older than 57?
I can't, no.
Wow. Nice.
Oh, wait, when was The Wizard of Oz? Yeah, that was.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. But I hated that movie. But this, okay, I'll go into it. I think this was I liked the story of this movie, but I couldn't really get behind it just because of just how slow it was, and I just feel like I was waiting for a payoff that just took too long in my mind. Overall, I don't think this is a bad movie by any means. I will talk about it later, but some of the technical stuff they're able to do in this is pretty extraordinary, especially for its time. And I think the performances are really good. I really like James Stewart in this movie. I'd never seen him in a movie before, but I know of him.
Yeah.
But he was really good in it. But again, I don't know if I would ever want to watch this movie again, to be honest with you. I'm guessing that you like fucking geek out for this thing. I'm guessing.
So all right.
I don't know. We'll find out.
Yeah,
I've never asked.
Yeah, you will. Yeah. So you will find out, as will the audience listening right now. So this is the second time I've seen Vertigo. I watched it for the first time in a film class a couple of years ago, and so then I watched it again for this. And I really like this movie a lot.
Oh, okay.
It's not one of my top Hitchcock movies.
Okay.
I really do like it a lot. I definitely understand where you're coming from with the whole. It is a very slow burn, and what I always say about slow burns, and we'll get more into this.
I love a lot of slow burns.
The thing about slow burns is slow burn really only works when you have the payoff, because if it's a slow burn and it's building and it's building and it's building and then it doesn't reach a satisfying point where you feel like it's built to something satisfying, then you just kind of look back at the movie and you're like, well, what was this whole thing for? But if you have a slow burn that works, and I think the best slow burn movie in my opinion is Alien, because
I think I might agree with you on that one.
Because it's a slow burn, and it's building, and it's building, and it's building. But then when you get to the point of what it's all building to, it's fantastic. And then you look back at the whole movie, and you're like, that whole thing was great. Because it's all about that end after the what it's all building to. Then you look back, and you're like, oh, this whole beginning was great. And then you rewatch Alien, and even though it's slow again, and you know where it's going, it still works. Vertigo, I think, and part of this is that movies at this time were made in a different way. And movies were made in a lot more where they were slower. They took more time to get where they were going. They weren't making movies for an age where people will watch something for 5 seconds and then keep scrolling, you know. And I'm not saying that's what you are, but that's kind of the mindset of that an audience has today. And so a lot of filmmakers, when they make movies, they're like, we have to have something big happen like every 5 minutes, or else the audience is going to stand up and walk out. So the time that this movie was made was vastly different, and it was made for a different audience that had more patience and waited more with the movie. So I do agree with you on the slow burn element. I think overall the performances, like you said, are great. I love a lot of the technical stuff, and just the stuff that they do by today's standards is not revolutionary, but the fact that they were doing it in 1958 and the way that they did it, like even some small tiny things which today we would just say, oh, no problem, you just do a green screen. Or, oh, no problem, you just do a digital effect. But they didn't have that. I mean, there were some green screen elements throughout this movie.
There were, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, but for the most part, I think this is a very interesting, compelling movie. It does take a while to get where it's going, but I think ultimately the slow nature of it kept reeling me in because I kept questioning, okay, where is this going? Where is this going? And I thought it was ultimately a satisfying film. Before we actually get into like discussing the ins and outs of this film, this is our first month of detective movies. And so I wanted to start off by kind of defining the qualities and attributes that we put towards detective movies. I'm curious, Rob, what would you kind of say are the overarching qualities of detective movies? What do you look for?
I'd say, I mean, a lot of it I think has to do with the overall, and I don't even think they necessarily have to be an actual detective for it to be a detective movie. I think detective movies have a lot to do with obsessing over something and just not being able to stop until you get to the bottom of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish or figure out. And that's how I would, I mean, I know we have some other movies like that, and I won't talk about them yet, but in this one we see, Scotty, and he has this obsession over this woman and this whole what the hell is going on, and he cannot stop till in the end he gets his answer, and then shit kind of goes by the wayside for him. But yeah, that's how I would describe a detective movie.
I liked that you said it was obsessive, because I think that is a key thing, because I think you have two genres of films that are similar to each other with detective movies and mystery movies.
Yes.
But I think the detective movie, because I think you can have a mystery movie where it doesn't necessarily follow a main person trying to figure it out. And I think there's a lot of overlap between a mystery movie and a detective movie. If you look at a movie that came out in 2019, Knives Out, I think that fits both a detective movie and a mystery movie, because there's a larger mystery that's being solved, but it's following the protagonist, who is a detective. And so there is overlap between the two. But I think in addition to it being an obsessive thing on the detective's part, I think it also is something where the mystery, or what the detective is trying to solve, becomes personal for the detective. The detective has some sort of, and again, detective not necessarily being that's their job, but they take on the role of the detective in the structure of the story. There's something personal about it for the detective. They have some sort of personal stake in what is going on. And maybe it starts out being personal, maybe it's made personal throughout the movie, or maybe at the end of the movie you realize that it was in fact personal, but I think that's also a key component to these movies. So now that we've kind of defined what we look at for detective movies, we can go into Vertigo. So we did talk about the slow burn element.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to say about that is, so like I said, I had seen 12 Angry Men, a movie, but I don't know about, I think you like that movie, I don't know.
I love 12 Angry Men.
I do too. And that is another movie that is incredibly slow, but you have, I think, incredibly rounded characters set in a small environment that's claustrophobic, and I think that movie works. With this movie, I don't know what it was. I had a hard time trying to be invested in this movie, and I don't know. It was kind of, I was like, I wanted to like it, because I had never seen an Alfred Hitchcock movie before, and I hear all this praise, but I don't know. I couldn't get into it.
Yeah, so for the record, Alfred Hitchcock is in my top 5 favorite directors of all time. I think he's a brilliant filmmaker. But it is interesting having Vertigo be your first exposure to Hitchcock, because Vertigo is largely a very different kind of movie for Hitchcock to make. Hitchcock really, he is sort of known for making big spectacle entertaining movies, and while they also do have human and deeper components to them that they're exploring through interesting characters, a lot of it is giving the audience a big thrill. And with Vertigo, while there are definitely spectacle moments and entertaining moments and thrilling moments, Vertigo is more restrained. It's more quiet. It's more character focused and following characters in a way that other Hitchcock movies don't do. And so I do think it is an interesting movie to lead off with in watching Hitchcock's filmography, because it is not necessarily wholly representative of the rest of the movies that he makes. But I think what makes Vertigo really interesting to me, and I mentioned this at the top, was while it's a slow burn, it reels you in, or at least it reeled me in, into trying to figure out, okay, so what's actually the substance here? Because on the surface, you're introduced to the main characters, and the guy, Gavin, wants Scotty to follow his wife, because he said something about, like, I think she's possessed by something, which is all just a red herring. But so you have that sort of supernatural element put in your head in the very beginning, and then Scotty is following her, and it's, for a while, it's just he's following her, seeing where she's going, and then he gets to know her after she jumps into the lake, and then he rescues her, and then they start to form a connection, and then it just kind of builds from there. And a lot of this, especially the first, I'd say, 40 or so minutes, when Madeline and Scotty, before they're introduced to each other, that first 40 minutes or so, it was pretty slow, and because not much was happening, but I'm sitting there thinking, okay, where is this going? What's the substance of this? And you might not necessarily have this predisposition, but for me, as a person who's watched Hitchcock movies, I know there's something more going on. There's something in the works. There's some sort of big twist, some sort of big moment, and of course, maybe just as a film fan, you can kind of see that right away.
Yeah, like I assumed, like this wasn't. It wasn't. First of all, I didn't think it was ever going to be supernatural. I don't know. It just didn't seem like that kind of movie to me.
Yeah.
It seemed like more of a realistic kind of movie. And also, knowing it's a detective movie, I was assuming, like, not everything is what it seems.
Yeah.
Like another movie like Knives Out, like, that movie, not spoiling that, but it kind of, in a way, shows its cards. But, like, as a viewer, you kind of say, because since you've seen movies, you're like, that's not all that this movie is. There's more to it, and I felt the same way with this one. And I will say the second half of this movie is a lot better than the first half. I'd say I had more entertainment watching the second half than I'd say the first half.
I think if anything, it could have been a little bit shorter. They could have just cut some out of that first act,
because after she like the death of the. Madeline was or was it Judy who died?
Madeline was the wife, the quote-unquote wife, and Judy was the real woman.
Oh, so when the real woman is thrown off the thing, I thought right after that happened and we get the scene where he's like in the hospital, I thought that's where the movie started to pick up for me a little bit, and I started to get on board with it a little bit more than I had.
Yeah. So going into some of the technical stuff. So the infamous Vertigo shot was made in this movie, which I think anyone who's seen Vertigo knows what we're talking about, the sort of zoom in. But you see that in a lot of other movies. It was developed in this film. It was created by the second unit camera person, Erman Roberts, and the idea for it was conceived by Hitchcock, and he had wanted to do it way back in his 1940 film, Rebecca. However, he didn't really have the means to be able to pull it off at the time, and then all the years later, when it came time for Vertigo, they were able to actually do it. And how it's accomplished is that it's a simultaneous zooming out as you track in. So the camera is moving in towards the subject as the lens are zooming out, giving it that sort of that feeling of vertigo that the main character has. And one, I think, I think the shot is so incredibly effective for what it means for the character in this movie. But then you've seen that replicated in so many other movies and what it means in those moments. You've seen it in moments in Jaws and Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. You see it used a lot, and it has a lot of cinematic oomph to it, partly because of what was attributed to it, how it was used in this film, but then also the life that's taken on its own in films to go.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the technical aspects, I know he had said who had remastered this, and it looked stunning. I have to say, it really, like, just from when it started, I was like, wow, this looks really good. And the score of the movie was really good. It kept you awake, I'd say, in some of the boring parts, just because of the booming sounds of it.
Yeah,
that was really good.
I love the opening title sequence, which I think is just like really interesting. It almost kind of looks like, the old Dell desktops where it would go to sleep and then you would have like the spirals or whatever on the screen. That's what it kind of looked like. Of course, well before that was conceived of for Dell. But the opening title sequence was actually the first time that a motion picture had used any computer graphics. Wow. And it was used in this film, and it was designed by Saul Bass. Really interesting technique for this film, and I think it very much, like, it puts you right in the spot of intrigue from the very beginning. You're like, oh, what's going on here? What is this? This is very interesting, and I love the whole dream sequence that you get in the middle of the movie.
Oh, you did? I didn't like that, to be honest.
I thought that...
I don't like dream sequences in any movie.
Well, it depends. I think it depends upon the film and what it means. I think for it being as surreal and trippy as it was in this, I think it worked.
The only dream sequences I like in a movie is Inception.
Well, I don't like I don't like when it's one of those like oh, you think it's real life, and then something starts to happen, and then the character wakes up. Yeah. I don't like that. But when it's something like this, where it's like you're never once thinking that it's real.
I'll give it that. Yep.
So I thought that was like one of the most compelling parts of the movie for me. I thought that was really, really interesting. So I loved that sequence. And then just the little moments of surrealism throughout the film, like there's a point, I believe it's near the end, when it's Scotty and Judy are in the apartment and they're kissing, and then it's doing like the pan around them, and it's moving around them, and then for the split second, it goes back to the stable. In the background, it goes back to the stable where they first kissed, back when Scotty thought it was Madeline. Yeah. And then it goes back, like, that's something today, if someone's going to make that happen in a movie, it's no problem at all. They're like, that's the easiest thing to do. But for them, in 1958, they had to be set up in a studio to have them on a rotating platform and create the full background to be able to have that rotation work and also have the timing work and everything. Like, the technical achievements in this film for the time that it came out, I think, are just staggering. I think what's really interesting about Vertigo is, and we'll probably get into more of this as the month goes on, but in many detective stories, the audience either figures out the mystery at the same time as the protagonist, the detective figure, or the audience usually learns after the detective has already figured out. Like, we'll get the point where we see, the detective has it figured out, but it's being withheld from us, or we learn at the same time as the detective. In Vertigo, it happens a little differently in that we learn before the protagonist learns what's going on. And I think a lot of filmmakers shy away from this because that kind of puts the protagonist then in a state of, well, if the audience knows more than the protagonist, then what's the point in seeing the continuation of that story? Because then the audience is just sitting there going, she's really Madeline, she's really Madeline, she's really the whole time, when the main character doesn't know. But I think for this movie, it's done in a very strategic way, because if you watch the whole portion of the movie where Scotty's dating Judy and she's trying on the clothes and he's forcing her and pressuring her into being more like Madeline and being more like Madeline, if we, the audience, don't know that Judy is Madeline, that has a very different tone.
See, I would have liked that, to be honest with you. I didn't really like when they like she was like pondering and then it just showed the whole scene of her. Like, I think I would have liked to just figure it out when he figured it out, to be honest with you. But
just because I think that, I feel like, at least if we didn't know that and it was just now the story of a guy who is like obsessively hung up on this girl that he used to love and is like at that point, that kind of becomes abusive. If you think that Judy is just some random girl who's now a victim to Scotty.
But in reality, he didn't know, though.
Yeah, he didn't know. But
so he was really kind of being abusive in a way.
Yes. Yeah, but I think that the perception that the audience has of him, I feel like it would have been far worse, because then you run the risk of having an incredibly unlikable protagonist, which for some we've talked about that a lot, but for this movie, that's not what this movie needed to be. And what I feel like is that might have been too sharp of a turn, but because we, the audience, knows that piece of information ahead of time, it changes the way that we're perceiving all these events that occur. So even though, yes, the way that we would have perceived it if we didn't know is exactly what was going on, it's all about what does the audience know and how are they looking at the events that are happening, not necessarily what are the actual events that are happening. And I think when you're involving a genre like a detective genre, where there are clues and there are pieces of information, and part of the structure of creating a mystery movie or a detective movie is who knows what piece of information, and that includes the audience. So I think it was very deliberate in structuring the tone of that last half of the movie, because if we didn't know that, it might have been that it was just a step too far and a lot of people just tuned out. And that's just my personal opinion.
No, I could too. Hey, I mean, again, I'm in the. I mean, I think it had like a 94 on Rotten Tomatoes. I guess sometimes you're just in the minority on things. You know what? And, but everybody's got their own opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting that Vertigo was not really well received when it initially came out. No, so I kind of caution against taking too much stock in the Rotten Tomatoes scores for movies going back this far, because a lot of it is compiled after the fact, and you don't really get the full weight of, because when Vertigo came out, like I was mentioning at the beginning of this episode, it was a very different movie from Alfred Hitchcock. And so a lot of people, I was reading up that a lot of people thought that Jimmy Stewart was too old to be playing a romantic lead, and that turned off a lot of people from the movie, and not a lot of people came out to see the movie. It didn't do well at the box office. It wasn't really well received when it came out by critics or by audience members at the time. And it's interesting that a movie that is really widely held as one of the best movies of all time, or has that kind of top status that we now attribute to it, like many movies that kind of come out in their time aren't appreciated and are appreciated after the fact. At the Oscars, it was nominated for... It's kind of interesting looking at older films and their Oscar nominations, because a lot of the wording for the awards are different. So it was nominated for Best Art Direction / Set Direction. And it was also nominated for Best Sound. So I think Art Direction / Set Direction, that would be probably equivalent to production design. Best Sound, they didn't have sound editing and mixing, it was just Best Sound.
Oh, okay.
And both elements I thought were very well used in the movie. But you would expect from a movie like Vertigo, which is held in such high status now, that it would have been up for Best Director, Best Picture, Best Performances, Best everything. And
he never even won one.
Hitchcock,
crazy to think about. But.
Yeah. I think a lot of these movies that are later revered as classics were not fully appreciated in their time.
Fight Club, all sorts of ones.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, just in general, that happens a lot of the time, that when a movie comes out, there are a lot of movies that come out that people love when they come out, and how many Best Picture winners nobody talks about now?
Crash, I'm sorry, that movie kind of stinks. The Artist, that's the biggest joke of all time, I think. Does anybody watch that anymore? Has anybody been like, oh my god, dude, I saw that again, it still holds up? Yeah.
There's so many times, so many movies that come out that, people go crazy for when they come out and are largely forgotten, and then movies that everyone overlooks and then are so revered in years to come. I don't know if you picked up on this, but I noticed the very beginning of Vertigo suspiciously looked a lot like the very opening of The Matrix. When you have the shot, the side profile shot of the cops and the person that they're chasing climbing up and down the tops of the roof, the way it was, the shots were structured, the lighting, the color of it looked a lot like the opening to The Matrix. And so I find that, like, when talking about the influence that this movie has had, you definitely see that influence in The Matrix.
I didn't even think of that. Another thing about, I don't know, like I feel like cops shouldn't like have to like chase people like across buildings. Like I almost felt that it was like almost like a superhero movie. I was like, this seems like a little like I mean, I know the cops put their lives on the line when it comes to like getting shot at and stuff, but it seemed like what did that guy like? Did we ever find out what that guy was that they were chasing? Like, no, what he had done?
No, I don't think so.
Like I mean, unless it was like some like big murder, I don't know. Like, was a risk was the risk of like falling off a building worth like jumping over buildings or whatever?
Yeah,
I don't know. Also, James Stewart was old too. Like, yeah. But
well, he's younger at the time that happened, because I think that was several years. The events in the movie were several years later, but not a huge age difference. But that was something we didn't really talk about, is how that, like, the vertigo and the acrophobia. Yeah. The acrophobia. I know there's a lot of misconception because this movie kind of made, when this movie came out, a lot of people like then were thinking, oh, vertigo is fear of heights, but that's
no.
Acrophobia is the fear of heights, and vertigo is that feeling of confusion and dizziness that is attributed as a result of the acrophobia. But I thought that was a really interesting thing for our main character to have that vital flaw. We don't always get that in our movies, where the main character has like that big vital flaw that is something that's hindering them.
Yeah.
And in the very beginning of the movie, we see a very weakened Scotty who can't even stand up on a footstep without feeling the vertigo. And so it's really interesting how they prop up this main character who is our lead person that we're following, but has such critical flaws, and they're not necessarily character flaws, but flaws that are outside of his control.
It reminded me a lot of that movie that came out a couple months ago, Motherless Brooklyn, in which Edward Norton was a detective and he had Tourette's. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I kept thinking about that, and I was like, oh, maybe he must have been influenced off of Vertigo.
I think a lot of detective movies are inspired by Vertigo, because I think that's part of going back and seeing Vertigo now in a 2020, seeing a movie that came out in 1958. You're like, like the story's a little average. Yeah. It's kind of like, it's like, well, it's because it's average. It's average because it influenced so many movies that now we just generally accept, oh yeah, that's just an average kind of story.
So the ending, what did you think of the ending? I thought it was kind of like I don't know, I wasn't really on board with it. Like,
when Judy fell?
A nun comes out and she like freaks out that much, she like freaking stumbles off the thing. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I think it was more the fact that it was Scotty's fault that she died. And so he once again, because you have at the very beginning set up that because of him, somebody falls to their death.
Yeah.
Then you have in the middle of the movie, he thinks that because of him, somebody falls to their death. And then it actually happens again at the end, and I thought it was just kind of like bringing it full circle.
I can agree with that. I just wish it was a better execution of her. Yeah. Like, I just found like just some random nun just walking in, and then her being so startled she falls off the like if there was something like, I don't know, she tripped over his foot, or I don't know, something a little bit more like coherent. I think I would have liked it a little more.
It was more directly his fault that she fell, as opposed to some happenstance.
Like, what were the chances like a nun just like showed up out of nowhere and she was so startled that she like backed up a couple feet and felt like, I don't know, didn't feel like realistic to me in a way.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that's something.
But
that
I do like the idea of her falling on and like it coming to full circle, like you said, though.
Yeah, and I think that's a bold way to end the movie. Like, that's the final shot is him standing, looking at her dead body, and being like, it happened again, and that's the end of the movie. That's a bold ending to that movie. So, as we move into our final thoughts on the film, Rob, what are your final thoughts on Vertigo?
Overall, like I said before, it was a movie that was just a little too slow for me, but packed with some other good things, with good performances and excellent technical achievements. But overall, I don't know if it was a movie I'd ever really want to watch again or own or recommend to just a regular moviegoer. So I think I would give it I'll go 2.9 out of 5.
Nice. So Vertigo, like I said at the top, is not one of my top favorite Hitchcock movies. I enjoy it a great deal. It's a very different kind of Hitchcock movie. I find it interesting as a detective movie because it is a slow burn that reels you in with trying to figure out where's this all going. You're trying to figure out the pieces of the puzzle. I think the technical achievements that we've talked about with the Vertigo shot, as well as some of the other things that they were attempting to do, like it being the first movie to ever use computer graphics and all these other different elements, I think are just the technical achievements in this film are outstanding, and both from the technical achievements and the story structure and everything else about this movie has long influenced movies to come. And I think the performances are great. I really enjoyed this movie. It is a little too slow in the beginning. I feel like it could have been a little bit shorter. It could have had a little bit faster pace to it to get where it's going. But I do feel like while maybe it wasn't as huge of a satisfying end to the film as I would have liked with how much and how long it takes to get to the end, I do largely enjoy this movie. I would give it a 4.0 out of 5. So that has been our discussion of 1958's Vertigo. Once again, I'm Nathanael Molnár. I'd like to thank Rob Giachinta for being here. Thanks for joining me. So, continuing on in our month of detective movies, the next film that we will be discussing is The Silence of the Lambs, which is one of my favorite movies.
I've never watched it all together.
Really? That's going to be an interesting discussion.
I own it, though. So
nice.
That's good.
Yeah, not to get too much into it, but it's one of my favorite movies. I adore that film. So that's going to be a very interesting discussion. So you'll want to tune in next week for our discussion of Silence of the Lambs. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content. Be sure to follow us on all of our various social medias at Movie Paradise 99, and you can also follow Movie Night Tonight on social media at Movie Night TNT. Movie Night Tonight drops every single week on Wednesdays. Usually, we've had a little bit of some scheduling issues that have resulted in it not dropping on Wednesdays. But going forward, it will drop weekly on Wednesdays. And you can find Movie Night Tonight. You can listen on YouTube. You can listen on Spotify. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for listening, and until our next podcast, thank you for listening.